Victor Vladilenovich, our subscribers have asked us to talk about growths, such as papillomas and condylomas, and which of them pose the greatest danger, as well as how to treat them, perhaps at home. Well, I want to point out that for some reason, there's a very popular opinion online that condylomas are in no way related to papillomas. So, dear viewers, we can all agree on what condylomas and papillomas are. It's very easy to define. Growths that extend from the skin on a thin stalk, with a so-called skin vascular ball hanging from it, are called papillomas. What you see as disintegrating, often compared to a small cauliflower like a half-dried flower, is considered a condyloma and is called a condyloma. They have a broad base. And again, I return to my idea that, in general, they are different from each other and have no connection whatsoever. They are directly related because papilloma is related to a virus, the human papillomavirus, and condylomas are too, and are essentially viral in origin. But the whole point is that, often being so-called benign skin growths, they pose a great danger precisely because their location indicates areas of tension, something Professor Tatiana Vladimirovna Kartavenko brilliantly discovered in her time under the designation of metabolically impaired zones. And understanding which part of the body they correspond to, and therefore the danger they may pose in this regard, is very important. There are certain types of pharmacy therapy, pharmacy treatment, but I want to say that all these methods are more, let's say, aesthetic in nature. Whether you cauterize it or not, it stays. In this sense, it's certainly important to understand. But at the same time, I want to point out that traditional folk medicine has often yielded very positive results in this regard. And today I want to share with you some secrets about how, unlike modern advances in so-called pharmaceutical chemistry, certain folk medicine techniques are very effective in curing certain skin growths. In this context, we're talking about papillomas and condylomas. And I'm happy to show you some of these techniques today. Which of these growths are, firstly, dangerous? And secondly, what do they indicate in terms of their location? Well, given what I've already said, thank you very much for the question. I mentioned earlier that they are all viral in origin, viral genesis, and their location very clearly indicates weakness, a weakening of the immune system in terms of the state of the adaptive immune atlas of the so-called organs or systems to which these papillomas and condylomas correspond. Therefore, the most dangerous locations today, and indeed traditionally have been, for both papillomas and condylomas, are those in the so-called armpits, especially in the center of the armpit. And why? Because that's where, by and large, the lymph nodes reside, an extension of the lymphatic system. This is what's called a lymphatic butterfly. To help you understand what a lymphatic butterfly is, imagine the center of your sternum, the center of your breastbone, is the body of a butterfly, and it has two wings, a left wing and a right wing. Now you can easily imagine what it would be like to see papillomas and condylomas in the axillary region, all the way to the end of the right costal arch. What does this indicate? It indicates a very high risk of viral infection, which can very quickly become disabling, that is, become oncological, that is, become a source of cancerous lesions in the mammary glands. In this case, it is fibrocystic mastopathy, which is accompanied by both papillomas and condylomas. Further, we have a location closer to the shoulder joint and the axillary region. This indicates that the right colon is affected, as is the right kidney, the liver system as a whole, and the biliary system. And in this regard, it's very important, dear colleagues, to understand that the right axillary area is under significant strain, indicating that the posterior hepatic ligament, or the so-called falciform ligament, is under significant tension, which, unfortunately, is rarely mentioned. A very common complaint, a very common symptom, is even an itchy rash in the middle of the right scapula, at the end of the scapula localized on the right. So-called scapular pruritus, when you want to scratch this particular area, what we call the dorsal surface of the body, as they say in the West, but we say the surface of the back, and even to the point of scratching. Such things happen. Very often, nocturnal scratching of the right axillary area, followed by maceration and the subsequent emergence of condylomas and papillomas, indicates an immune threat, particularly in the weakening of the liver's detoxification and blood purification functions. Indirectly, I would like to point out, this may even be a sign of the further development of varicose veins on the right side, especially in the vessels of the right lower extremity. This can often indicate that long before changes in lipid and blood biochemistry occur, there are already signs of the development of metabolic syndrome, which many of you know as insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is, in any case, a very clear illustration of developing hepatic hepatosis. And when we talk about what is involved in the ascending colon or the right kidney, it's very important to understand that these very common moments of vague languor on the right side, a vague twisting and turning sensation, a desire to twist the right shoulder, a desire to make certain movements. Sometimes there's a spastic condition in the area of, let's say, the appendicular angle, even to the point where a person's gait on the right side changes. Sometimes people start complaining, I'm walking and out of nowhere my leg suddenly gives way, or out of nowhere I get a cramp in the area of the right hip. This whole, let's say, exposition or presentation of these symptoms is very clear, and against the background of papillomas and condylomas, it very clearly indicates that this entire working right side of our body is very important. From what perspective? I'd like to point out that the ascending colon itself is very important. Its composition, its constituents, and its health are very important indicators of how the small intestine is functioning. If we have problems with gas formation, if we have problems with gastric prolapse, if we have problems with things like morning weakness, loss of appetite, constipation, belching of old food, and so on, a cramping condition manifests itself as an attack of appendicitis. And by the time the ambulance takes you to the emergency room of the surgical hospital, this spasm subsides. And sometimes these symptoms recur several times. There was even a term in the 1940s and 1950s, my great-grandfather told me, called carriage appendicitis. An ambulance would arrive, and there would be complaints of contractions in the area of the so-called appendicular angle. And while the person was being transported, do you understand what this was accompanied by? They're transporting the person. The spasm begins with movement, and with movement it begins to subside. And by the way, for some reason, with all this, our valiant doctors forgot that since the days of German surgery, since the time of Billroth, there was even a test called the heel test. When such cramping pains accompanied a person, Dr. Billroth proposed this technique, if we'll call it a technique, where they simply tapped the patient's heel and then they tapped the person's right heel, and the pain was relieved. And, by the way, I want to share with you that this technique from a health perspective alone is wonderfully used in Tibetan medicine. It's wonderfully used not only in Tibetan medicine, but in the Tibetan way of life in general. And if any of you read Italian or English, you can find Marco Polo's diaries in an accessible format. So Marco Polo, the famous spy and traveler, even describes a test called heel walking. Heel walking. So Tibetan doctors, Tibetan lamas, emchis, advised people who come to other countries, who begin to eat foreign food that is unfamiliar to them, who begin to drink unfamiliar water, who sit down at a table and cannot refuse the hosts. The food on the table is unusual. Then, after eating, consuming this food, you then get up and perform these heel movements 80 times. By the way, the great French adept of reflexology, Professor Dr. Georges Soulier de Moran, who follows my work with Tatiana Vladimirovna, you know that we often demonstrate Georges Soulier de Moran's ulnar counting techniques. These things are very similar. Why? Because the right heel, the right elbow, these correspond to the right side, the right kidney and liver, the bile ducts, the right shoulder, and so on and so forth. So in this sense, it's very important to understand. When we see the location of papillomas, papillomas on the right side and condylomas on the right side, this indicates that, yes, I've said it again and I'll repeat it again. Yes, viral aggression is brewing. Viral aggression is brewing, but apply the same to the left side. If, say, you have those same papillomas on the left side of your breast, under your left breast, in the submammary line, or in the left armpit on your left side, and you see these so-called papillomas, at first glance, they're unsightly. They're often unsightly, but for some reason they're considered completely harmless. Then imagine that feeling of languor. It's from the heart, and the frequent mood swings when someone tells you, make your face kinder, smile. And the person sits there, wanting to smile like that, but they can't. Why can't they? Because of the human papillomavirus. I'll tell you something amazing now. Human papillomaviruses in human papillomas. Condylomaviruses in human condylomas. Do you know what they affect? They affect the state of our brain. They affect the state of our brain hormones. Brain hormones. And by the way, I'd like to point out that there's even such a syndrome complex. A syndrome complex where a person loses control of their appetite while having condylomas and papillomas. I ask you to pay attention to this, both from a lay perspective and from the perspective of doctors, professional physicians, from the perspective of medical clinical thinking. But nevertheless, what are we returning to? We're returning to the fact that folk medicine, folk wisdom, has noted these things since time immemorial. This is not a problem of the 17th, 18th, 19th, or later, or even the 21st century. As one of my great teachers, the Rostov genius, the magician and wizard of microbiology and virology, Professor Alexander Efimovich Essel, said, "A virus is a virus, and it will always be there, and it will always be there, as long as humanity exists." And in this regard, it's crucial to understand that while we keep viruses in check, at what cost? Because we have a strong immune system, because we're resilient, because we keep ourselves in good shape, both physically and mentally, and so on and so forth. We take care of ourselves in terms of nutrition, so viruses will, of course, try to, so to speak, become masters in our bodies, in our organisms. But nevertheless, this is a very old problem, and people have paid attention to it. And in this regard, of course, dear colleagues, it's very important to understand another, I believe, very important point in terms of our attitude towards papillomas, our attitude towards condylomas. The thing is, by and large, imagine this, and there's nothing to imagine here. Our skin is our largest organ. Imagine about if you can talk about my size that way, just don't use my skin as a drum. I beg you, for Christ's sake. There. But imagine that I have about 2.2 square meters of skin. This is my largest organ. Apply this to yourself. Apply this to yourself. How much skin can you possibly have? And if we're already starting to experience these skin-related manifestations, it indicates that our metabolism, in terms of cleansing, is already leaking somewhere. And what does this indicate? It indicates that the quality of our body's cleansing is becoming quite limited. And in this regard, of course, it's crucial to understand that if we don't cleanse our body properly, if we treat our body like a cavalry charge, if we suddenly start cleansing ourselves with all sorts of different methods that can only now be found on the internet, then there's nothing but harm to ourselves, nothing but vileness. As academician Ivan Petrovich Pavlov loved to say, improper hygiene is nothing more than a vile attitude toward one's own body. The most profound words of the greatest genius of medical physiology. So our cleansing system is already starting to, as I said, make these very mistakes. And so all these papillomas and condylomas act as a kind of beacon for us, a kind of signal that it's time to take care of ourselves. Otherwise, what else? Otherwise, the next stage is cancer, skin cancer. And if we're talking about our skin being an external screen for our internal organs, our systems, this means that this cancer can easily project itself onto those areas of the body that these papillomas and condylomas actually represent. So today I wanted to share with you some secrets of folk wisdom, I believe, in this area where we're not just addressing aesthetic issues, but actually using this combination, which at first glance seems quite exotic to many, is generally considered a great way not only to alleviate these problems in the body, but also to project, that is, reflect, and send these very same anti-inflammatory, antiviral signals inward. So where do we start? Well, let's start. What do we most often have on hand? Most often, we have, as my beloved mother-in-law used to say, garlic. And most often, what do we have? Vinegar. What are we doing? There's a very interesting secret about using vinegar. I want to say that you can use any vinegar in this regard. I have rice vinegar, which is wonderful. I have apple cider vinegar. You can use wine vinegar here, and so on and so on and so on and so on. It doesn't matter. The most important thing is vinegar. What's the reason for this? It's because vinegar acts very differently on the body. Passing through papillomas, passing through condylomas, it actually sends this very reflex signal to the organ, which has already been, in a certain sense, virally altered. And an internal battle begins with these very viruses, which, due to the body's slightly weakened viral defenses, begin to project all this onto the skin's surface. So what do? Take 2 or 3 teaspoons of apple cider vinegar and bring it to a hot state. Hot. That is, you should reach the threshold of steam. Steam. The vinegar begins to steam slightly. As soon as you start to see this steam, take any cotton pad. Position the cotton pad so that the vinegar steam that is released, saturates the cotton pad.